She didn't scream. She didn't throw her boarding pass. When the gate agent sneered and pointed her toward the back of the line, dismissing her as if she were invisible, Morgan St. James simply adjusted her glasses and tapped a single command into her phone. The passengers behind her laughed, mocking her hoodie and worn sneakers, unaware that the woman they were jeering at didn't just buy a ticket. She had the power to buy the entire airline. 5 minutes later, the engines cut out, the pilot walked off, and the monitors flashed a single, terrifying update. Flight canceled by order of the board. The silence that followed was deafening. This is the story of how one act of disrespect cost a crew their careers and taught a crowded terminal that you never judge a book by its cover. The automatic doors of Terminal 4 at JFK International Airport parted with a hiss, admitting a gust of biting November wind and a woman who looked like she had just rolled out of a college dorm room. Morgan St. James pulled the hood of her charcoal sweatshirt up over her messy bun, clutching a lukewarm coffee in one hand and a battered leather duffel bag in the other. To the thousands of rushing travelers, Morgan was nobody. She was an obstacle, a drifter, a young woman likely flying on a budget ticket to visit family in the Midwest. The reality, buried under layers of casual cotton and fatigue, was starkly different. At 32, Morgan was the majority shareholder and CEO of Helios Global, a logistics and infrastructure conglomerate that quietly ran the back-end systems for half the Fortune 500. Her net worth wasn't just in the millions. It hovered in a bracket where the numbers ceased to matter, replaced by raw, unchecked influence. But today, Morgan wasn't the CEO. She was just a tired daughter. She had spent the last 48 hours at a bedside in a hospice facility in Queens, saying a slow, agonizing goodbye to her childhood nanny. She was emotionally hollowed out, physically drained, and desperate to get back to her estate in San Francisco to sleep for a week. She hadn't booked a private jet. Her usual Gulfstream was grounded for maintenance in Teterboro, and she hadn't wanted to wait for a charter. She grabbed the first commercial first-class ticket available on Regal Atlantic Airways, Flight 492 to SFO. She approached the check-in counter, her eyes stinging from lack of sleep. The airport was a zoo. The economy line snaked back and forth between the stanchions, a river of frustrated humanity. The priority access lane, however, was empty, save for a pristine red carpet. Morgan stepped onto the red carpet. "Excuse me! Excuse me!" The voice was shrill, cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal like a jagged knife. Morgan paused and looked up. A gate agent with hair sprayed into a rigid helmet of blonde curls was leaning over the podium, pointing a manicured finger at her. Her name tag read Brenda. "Ma'am, you need to exit the carpet." Brenda snapped, her voice loud enough to turn heads in the nearby economy queue. "The restrooms are back toward the entrance." Morgan blinked, confused. "I'm not looking for the restroom. I'm checking in for Flight 492. Brenda let out a short, derisive huff. She looked Morgan up and down, her gaze lingering on the fraying hem of Morgan's jeans and the scuffed toes of her sneakers. "This is the priority lane, sweetheart. First class and Diamond Medallion members only. Economy check-in is that way." She gestured vaguely toward the chaotic mass of people to the left. "I know," Morgan said, her voice raspy. She cleared her throat. "I have a first-class ticket." Brenda didn't even check her computer. She just shook her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "I highly doubt that. Now, please move. You're blocking the lane for our actual premium customers." Morgan felt a familiar heat rise in her chest. Not anger, but a cold, hard resolution. "My name is Morgan St. James. If you check the manifest, you'll see I'm in seat 1A. I'm not checking anything until you step aside," Brenda retorted, crossing her arms. Behind Morgan, a man cleared his throat loudly. He was wearing a bespoke Italian suit, a Patek Philippe watch glinting on his wrist, and carrying a Toomey briefcase. He smelled of expensive cologne and entitlement. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice smooth but laced with irritation. "Some of us have meetings to get to." Brenda's demeanor flipped instantly. She beamed at the man, her smile saccharine and practiced. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wells. I'm just trying to clear out some unauthorized foot traffic. She shot a glare at Morgan. Miss, I am going to call security if you don't move to the back of the line where you belong. Morgan turned to look at the man, Mr. Wells. He looked at her with pure disdain. Come on, honey, he said, waving a hand dismissively. Don't make this hard on yourself. The bus station is probably down the street. A few people in the economy line snickered. Morgan tightened her grip on her duffel bag. She was tired. She was grieving. And she was absolutely done being polite. I'm not moving, Morgan said softly. Scan my ID. That's all you have to do. Brenda sighed, a theatrical sound of pure martyrdom. Fine. Give it here. But when it declines, you are going to the back of the line, and I'm flagging you for disruptive behavior. Morgan slid her ID and her phone across the counter. Brenda snatched them up, her acrylic nails clicking aggressively against the marble. She typed the name in, expecting a satisfying error message. The screen beeped. A green light flashed. Brenda frowned. She typed again. The screen flashed green again. Passenger, Street, James, Morgan. Status, VIP, Seat, 1A. Brenda stared at the screen for a long second. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on her face. She couldn't reconcile the woman in the hoodie with the data on the screen. Instead of apologizing, Brenda's face flushed with spite. She felt foolish, and she hated Morgan for making her feel that way. Well, Brenda sniffed, tossing the ID back onto the counter rather than handing it to Morgan. The system must be glitching. But fine, you're checked in. She printed the boarding pass and slapped it down. Gate B12, boarding in 40 minutes. And try to look presentable before you get on the plane. You're going to disturb the other first-class passengers smelling like outside. Morgan took her ID and passed slowly. She looked Brenda dead in the eye. You have no idea what you just did, Brenda. Move along. Brenda barked, already looking past her to Mr. Wells. Mr. Wells, so sorry for the delay. Welcome to Regal Atlantic. Morgan walked away, the sound of Mr. Wells chuckling behind her. She thinks this is over, Morgan thought, feeling the cold weight of her phone in her pocket. It hasn't even started. The Regal Atlantic Lounge was an oasis of calm compared to the terminal, but Morgan didn't get to enjoy it. As she approached the frosted glass doors, the receptionist, who had likely been radioed by Brenda, stopped her. Capacity is full right now, miss, the young man said, not even making eye contact. Morgan looked through the glass. There were clearly empty seats. There are empty seats right there. Reserved? He lied smoothly. Morgan didn't argue this time. She turned around and walked to the gate. She needed to see how deep the rot went. If the gate agents were this emboldened, it spoke to a systemic failure in Regal Atlantic's culture, a culture she happened to know a lot about, considering Helios Global was currently renegotiating the fuel logistics contract that kept Regal Atlantic profitable. She found a seat near Gate B12. She pulled out her laptop, a sleek, unbranded machine with military-grade encryption. She opened a secure chat channel. User M_St. James status. Online M_St. James. Pull the file on Regal Atlantic Airways. Specifically, the JFK Ground Operations Staff and the current active fuel leverage agreement. User J_Kovacs, COO, on it. Everything okay? You were supposed to be offline. M_St. James. I'm being treated like a vagrant by the staff of a company we effectively subsidize. Who is the station manager at JFK? User J_Kovacs. Give me 2 minutes. While she waited, the gate area began to fill. The man from check-in, Preston Wells, arrived. He was talking loudly on his phone, pacing back and forth in front of Morgan's seat. Yeah, total disaster at check-in, Preston was saying, laughing. Some homeless-looking chick tried to sneak into the priority lane. Brenda handled it, though. Put her in her place. Yeah, it's just standards, you know. You let one in, they all swarm. He stopped pacing and looked down. He realized he was standing right in front of Morgan. He grinned, a shark-like baring of teeth. "Oh, look, it's the celebrity," Preston mocked, lowering his phone. "Did you manage to steal a ticket, or did you beg for it?" Morgan looked up from her screen. "Mr. Wells, is it? You work for Harrison and Cole, judging by the luggage tag." Preston's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I'm a senior partner. Not that you'd know what that means." "I know it means you bill clients $400 an hour to file paperwork that paralegals do for $20, Morgan said calmly. "And I know that Harrison and Cole represents Regal Atlantic in their labor disputes." Preston stepped closer, looming over her. The mockery was gone, replaced by aggression. "You need to watch your mouth. You have no idea who you're talking to. Attention, passengers." Brenda's voice boomed over the PA system at the gate. "We are ready to begin boarding for Flight 492 to San Francisco. We will begin with our first-class passengers and active military." Preston straightened his jacket. "That's my cue. Enjoy the middle seat near the toilets, honey." He walked toward the jet bridge entrance. Morgan stood up and gathered her bag. She walked toward the lane. Brenda was there, scanning passes. When she saw Morgan approaching, she held up a hand. "Hold on," Brenda said loud enough for the line to hear. "Sir, you go ahead." She waved Preston through. Then she turned to Morgan. "I need to check your bag." "You checked it at the counter," Morgan said. "It looks too big for the overhead bins in first class," Brenda lied. "And frankly, it's filthy. We can't have that dripping on other passengers' luggage. I'm going to have to gate check it. And since you didn't pay the baggage fee, that will be $75. "It fits," Morgan said, her voice dropping an octave. "And I am not paying you a dime." "Then you aren't getting on the plane." Brenda smiled, crossing her arms. Behind Morgan, the line began to grumble. "Come on, just pay the fee," someone shouted. "We're going to be late. Get out of the way." Preston, who had paused at the door to the jet bridge to watch the show, laughed. "Broke and stubborn. Bad combination." Morgan looked at Brenda. "You are refusing me boarding unless I pay an arbitrary fee for a carry-on that is compliant with FAA regulations?" "I'm refusing you because you are being non-compliant and disruptive," Brenda said. She reached for her radio. "Security to gate, B12. I have a passenger refusing instructions." Morgan took a deep breath. This was it. The point of no return. She looked at her phone. A message from her COO, Kovacs, had popped up. J_Kovacs, station manager, is unreachable, but I have the override codes for the corporate account. We own the debt on their 3 newest Boeings. Technically, we can recall the assets if there's a breach of brand integrity. Morgan smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm smile. "Okay," Morgan said to Brenda. "You win. I'll step aside." Brenda smirked triumphantly. "Smart choice. Stand over there until everyone else has boarded. If there's space left, maybe we'll squeeze you in." Morgan stepped out of the line, leaning against the cold glass of the terminal window. She watched the passengers file past, some looking at her with pity, most with annoyance. Preston Wells gave her a mocking salute as he disappeared down the jet bridge. Morgan unlocked her phone. She didn't open her banking app. She opened the Helios Global Administrative Dashboard. She navigated to the Assets and Liabilities tab. She found the entry for Regal Atlantic Airways, Fleet Lease Agreement. She tapped the file. She scrolled down to Clause 14B, Immediate Termination for Breach of Conduct. She hit Execute. Then she dialed a number. It wasn't customer service. It was the personal cell phone number of the CEO of Regal Atlantic, a man named Arthur Vance, whom she had met at Davos the previous winter. He answered on the second ring. "Morgan, I didn't expect to hear from you until the quarterly review." "Hello, Arthur," Morgan said, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm currently at Gate B12 at JFK. Your staff just threatened to call security on me because I didn't look rich enough to sit in the seat I paid for." Your gate agent, Brenda, is currently publicly humiliating me." "What?" Arthur sounded horrified. "Morgan, I am so sorry. Put her on the phone immediately." "No, Arthur, it's too late for that," Morgan said, watching the final passenger board. Brenda was now closing the door to the jet bridge, looking satisfied. "I don't want an apology. I want to teach you a lesson about your company culture." "Morgan, wait. What are you doing?" "I just invoked Clause 14B, Morgan said calmly. "As of 30 seconds ago, Helios Global has seized the collateral for our loan. Specifically, the aircraft sitting at Gate B12. It's my plane now, Arthur, and I'm canceling the flight." "Morgan, you can't! That flight is full!" "Not anymore," Morgan said. "Now it's just a very expensive parking lot." She hung up. She watched through the glass as the jet bridge began to retract, then suddenly stopped. A moment later, the movement reversed. The bridge reconnected to the plane. Brenda, who was typing at her terminal, looked up in confusion as the phone on her desk began to ring violently. A red light on the wall behind her began to flash. Morgan stood there, phone in hand, and waited for the chaos to begin. Inside the cabin of Flight 492, the atmosphere was one of exclusive comfort. The first-class cabin was a cocoon of soft leather, low ambient lighting, and the clinking of crystal flutes. Preston Wells was settled into seat 2A, already on his second glass of pre-flight champagne. He had reclined his seat slightly, enjoying the feeling of superiority that came with priority boarding. He was recounting the incident at the gate to the flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah who was forced to listen with a polite, frozen smile. "It's just about maintaining standards, Sarah," Preston said, gesturing with his glass. "You let people like that get comfortable, and suddenly the whole brand suffers." She looked like she'd just crawled out of a dumpster. Honestly, Brenda did the right thing, threatening security. "I'm sure the ground staff handled it according to protocol, Mr. Wells," Sarah said diplomatically, topping off his drink. "We should be pushing back shortly." "Good," Preston sighed. "I have a dinner reservation in San Francisco that costs more than that girl's entire wardrobe. Can't be late." Outside, at the gate, the world was collapsing around Brenda. The red phone on the wall behind the podium wasn't just ringing, it was screaming. Brenda stared at it, her hands trembling. She had never heard that specific ringtone before. It was the emergency operations line, reserved for hijackings, bomb threats, or catastrophic mechanical failures. She picked it up, her voice shaking. "Gate B12, this is Brenda." "Brenda, this is Marcus Thorne, VP of Operations." A voice roared on the other end. "Why has the asset seizure protocol been activated for Flight 492? Why am I getting alerts from Helios Global Legal that we are in breach of contract?" Brenda's stomach dropped to the floor. "I don't know, sir. I just refused boarding to a disruptive passenger, a woman in a hoodie." "What was her name?" Thorne demanded. "St. James. Morgan St. James." The silence on the other end was more terrifying than the shouting. "You refused boarding to Morgan St. James?" Thorne whispered, his voice laced with pure dread. "Brenda, do you have any idea what you've done? That's not a passenger. That is the woman who owns the debt on every drop of fuel in that plane. She just invoked a kill clause. What do I do?" Brenda squeaked, watching as Morgan stood by the window, calmly tapping on her phone. "You pray," Thorne said, "and you do exactly what she says. I'm contacting the captain." The line went dead. Brenda looked up. Morgan had turned away from the window and was walking back toward the podium. The crowd of standby passengers and economy travelers watched her, sensing the shift in power even if they didn't understand it. Morgan didn't look angry. She looked like a natural disaster waiting to happen. "Open the door, Brenda," Morgan said. She didn't shout. She didn't ask. It was a command. "The flight is closed," Brenda stammered, falling back on her training even as her world crumbled. "The manifest is locked." "The manifest is irrelevant because the flight isn't going anywhere," Morgan said. "Open the door. I need to speak to my pilot." My pilot. The words hung in the air. Brenda, pale and sweating, typed the code. The door to the jet bridge buzzed open. Morgan stepped through. She didn't run. She walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, the sound of her sneakers soft against the metal ramp. She reached the door of the aircraft. The lead flight attendant, Sarah, was just preparing to close the main cabin door. She looked up, startled to see a woman in a hoodie standing there. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Boarding is comp." Morgan didn't stop. She stepped past Sarah, entering the galley. "I'm not a passenger today, Sarah. I'm the landlord." Morgan turned left, stepping into the first-class cabin. The sudden appearance of the homeless girl caused a ripple of murmurs. Preston Wells, who had been scrolling through his emails, looked up. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in anger. "Oh, for God's sake," Preston groaned loudly. "How did you get past security? Stewardess, get this trash off the plane." Morgan stopped in the center of the aisle, right between row 1 and row 2. She stood tall, her posture shifting from tired traveler to boardroom executioner. She looked at Preston, then scanned the faces of the other first-class passengers who were looking at her with mixtures of disgust and amusement. Captain Miller, a veteran pilot with gray temples and a stern face, stepped out of the cockpit. He had just received a confusing message via ACARS, Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, that simply read, "Asset owner on board. Await instruction." He saw the woman in the hoodie, he saw the way she held herself, and then he saw the ID badge she slowly pulled from her pocket. It wasn't a boarding pass. It was a solid black card with a gold Helios sun embossed on it, the highest level of security clearance in the aviation logistics world. Captain Miller stopped dead. He knew that logo. He knew who signed his paychecks indirectly. "Ms. St. James?" the captain asked, his voice stunned. Preston laughed. "Captain, don't waste your time talking to her. Just have her arrested so we can take off." Morgan ignored Preston entirely. She looked at the captain. The cabin fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. "Captain Miller," Morgan said softly, "this aircraft is currently collateral in a defaulted agreement between Regal Atlantic and Helios Global. As of 3 minutes ago, the lease is terminated." "Terminated?" the captain blinked. "Ma'am, we have 200 souls on board. We're fueled and pushed." "Not anymore," Morgan said. She raised her right hand. The cabin watched, mesmerized. She didn't scream. She didn't make a speech. She simply looked the captain in the eye, raised her hand level with her neck, and made a sharp, horizontal cutting motion. The silent gesture. Captain Miller didn't hesitate. He knew the hierarchy. He turned back to the cockpit, flipped 2 switches on the overhead panel, and killed the engines. The hum of the turbines, a sound so constant you only noticed it when it was gone, vanished. The air conditioning whirred down to a stop. The ambient lighting flickered and died, replaced by the harsh, battery-operated emergency strips. The fasten seatbelt signs went dark. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a billion-dollar machine turning into a paperweight. Preston's mouth fell open. The champagne glass in his hand tilted, spilling expensive liquid onto his pants, but he didn't even notice. Morgan lowered her hand. She turned to face the cabin, her face illuminated by the eerie emergency lights. "This flight is canceled," she announced, her voice ringing clear in the dead silence. "You are all trespassing on private property. Get off." For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The shock was too total. The transition from the luxury of an impending takeoff to the dark, silent reality of a powered-down jet was jarring. Then the chaos erupted. "What do you mean canceled?" a woman in row 3 shrieked. "I have a connection in Tokyo." "Turn the air back on. It's getting hot." Preston Wells unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his face beet red. He stormed into the aisle, getting within inches of Morgan's face. "Listen to me, you psychotic little nobody," Preston spat, veins bulging in his neck. "You can't just walk onto a plane and trick the pilot into shutting it down. Do you know who I am? I am going to sue you for every penny you'll ever make. I'm going to have you thrown in a federal prison for hijacking." Morgan didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses, looking at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a bug. "You're Preston Wells," she said calmly, "senior partner at Harrison & Cole. Your firm is currently representing Regal Atlantic in a dispute regarding unpaid tarmac fees at Heathrow. You're flying to San Francisco to meet with the venture capital firm Blue Horizon to discuss a potential merger to save this airline from bankruptcy." Preston froze. The color drained from his face. "How do you know that? That's privileged information." "It's not privileged when I own Blue Horizon." Morgan dropped the bomb casually. A gasp went through the first-class cabin. "The twist, Mr. Wells," Morgan continued, her voice gaining, "Steele, is that I wasn't flying to San Francisco to sleep. I was flying there to sign the bridge loan that would keep this airline afloat for another 6 months. I was going to save your client. I was going to save this crew's jobs." She gestured to Sarah, the flight attendant, who was pressing her hands over her mouth in horror. "But," Morgan said, stepping closer to Preston, forcing him to take a step back, "then I met Brenda, and then I met you, and I realized that if the culture of Regal Atlantic allows a paying customer to be treated like garbage because she's wearing a hoodie, then this company isn't worth saving." "No," Preston whispered, "you can't be her." "I am her," Morgan said, "and as of right now, the deal with Blue Horizon is off. I'm letting Regal Atlantic fail." The gravity of the situation hit the cabin like a physical blow. It wasn't just a canceled flight. They were watching a corporate execution live. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the jet bridge. "Finally!" Preston yelled, turning toward the door. "The police! Officer! Arrest this woman! She's hijacked the plane!" 3 officers from the Port Authority Police Department burst into the cabin. They were led by a sergeant with a thick neck and a no-nonsense expression. Behind them, looking terrified, was Brenda. "Who is Morgan St. James?" the sergeant barked. Preston pointed a shaking finger at Morgan. "Her! That's her! She shut down the plane! Take her away!" The sergeant looked at Morgan. He looked at the hoodie. Then he looked at the piece of paper in his hand. A fax that had just come through from the district attorney's office, flagged by Helios Global's legal team. The sergeant stepped past Preston, ignoring him completely. He stopped in front of Morgan and removed his hat. "Ms. St. James," the sergeant said, his tone respectful, "we received your asset seizure order. We're here to enforce the eviction. Do you want these people removed immediately?" Preston looked like he had been slapped. "What? Eviction? I paid $3,000 for this seat." "And now you're squatting," Morgan said coldly. "Officer, I want everyone off the plane. But I want 2 people detained for interference with a federal asset owner." "Name them," the sergeant said, taking out his notepad. Morgan pointed at Brenda, who was cowering in the galley doorway. "Her, for discrimination and failure to adhere to FAA boarding protocols." Then she pointed at Preston. "And him, for verbal assault and threatening a corporate officer." "This is insanity!" Preston screamed as an officer grabbed his arm. "I am a lawyer. I know my rights." "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said, spinning Preston around and cuffing him. "And I suggest you use it, because you're annoying me." As Preston was dragged down the aisle, kicking and screaming, the other passengers sat in stunned silence. They looked at Morgan with fear. They had laughed at her 20 minutes ago. Now she held their fate in her hands. Morgan turned to the rest of the cabin. "The rest of you," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You are victims of this airline's incompetence as much as I am. My team is currently arranging a charter flight on a Helios jet. It will be waiting at Gate B-14 in 1 hour. It's free, open bar, and the seats are better than these." A collective sigh of relief washed over the cabin. "However," Morgan added, raising a finger, "that offer extends to the economy passengers as well. In fact, on my plane, there is no economy. Everyone sits together. If any of you have a problem sitting next to someone who paid less than you can stay here in the dark." Nobody said a word. Morgan turned to the captain. "Captain Miller, I'm offering you and your crew a contract with Helios Aviation, effective immediately, triple your current salary. But you leave the uniforms here." Captain Miller looked at his hat, emblazoned with the Regal Atlantic logo, a company that had cut his pension twice in the last 5 years. He looked at Sarah, who was nodding tearfully. Slowly, Captain Miller took off his hat and placed it on the dashboard of the cockpit. "I believe I'm available for hire, Ms. St. James." Miller grinned. Morgan nodded. She grabbed her duffel bag, pulled her hood back up, and walked toward the exit. As she passed Brenda, who was crying as the police read her rights, Morgan stopped. "You told me to look presentable," Morgan whispered to her. "Next time, worry less about how people look, and more about who they are." She walked out of the plane, leaving the darkness behind her, followed by a procession of stunned passengers, a liberated flight crew, and a handcuffed lawyer who had just lost the biggest deal of his life. But the karma wasn't done yet. The real fallout was just beginning in the terminal. The procession that marched from Gate B12 to Gate B14 was unlike anything JFK International Airport had ever witnessed. It wasn't just a line of passengers. It was a revolution. News of the event had spread through the terminal like wildfire. Passengers from other gates were standing on chairs, pressing their faces against the glass, and holding up their phones to record the spectacle. The video of Morgan St. James standing in the dimmed cabin, illuminated only by emergency lights, had already hit TikTok and Twitter. The hashtag the silent gesture was trending #1 globally, displacing the Super Bowl halftime show announcements. Morgan walked at the front, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She hadn't changed her clothes. She was still the woman in the hoodie and sneakers, but the way she moved had changed. She walked with the terrifying calm of a general who had just conquered a city without firing a single shot. Behind her, the contrast was stark. The first-class passengers, usually the ones looking down their noses at the HOI polloi, were now looking around nervously, stripped of their superiority. They were just people hoping for a ride home. But the real story was the economy passengers. A grandmother who had been traveling with 3 crying toddlers and who had been rudely told by Brenda earlier to keep her kids quiet or lose her seat, was now walking next to a hedge fund manager. "Excuse me, Miss St. James?" the grandmother called out timidly. Morgan stopped and turned. The entire procession halted. "Yes?" Morgan asked gently. "Is it true?" the woman asked, clutching a diaper bag. "You're really taking us all? Even us? I only paid for basic economy. No carry-on allowed." Morgan smiled, and for the first time that day, it reached her eyes. "Ma'am, on a Helios jet, there is no basic economy. There are only guests, and guests don't pay for luggage. You and your grandchildren will have your own suite." The grandmother burst into tears. The crowd erupted in cheers, a raw, emotional sound that echoed off the high ceilings of Terminal 4. However, the path to Gate B14 wasn't clear yet. As they rounded the corner near the food court, a phalanx of suits blocked their path. It was Marcus, the VP of Operations, who had been screaming on the phone earlier, accompanied by 2 corporate lawyers from Regal Atlantic and a team of frantic PR specialists. Marcus looked like a man who was watching his career burn down in real time. He was sweating profusely, his tie loosened. "Ms. St. James! Ms. St. James! Please, we need to talk!" Marcus shouted, holding up his hands. "You can't just take the passengers. This is poaching. It's theft of service." Morgan didn't stop walking until she was toe-to-toe with him. She was 5'7", but she loomed over him. "Theft?" Morgan repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "Marcus, isn't it?" I just saved these people from being stranded on a plane that I legally repossessed because your staff violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and about a dozen consumer protection laws. I'm not poaching them. I'm rescuing them." "We can fix this," one of the lawyers interjected, trying to look authoritative. "We can issue vouchers. We can upgrade everyone. Please, let's go to the lounge and discuss a settlement. If you fly these people out on a competitor's jet, Regal Atlantic stock will tank by morning." Morgan laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You still don't get it," she said. "I don't care about your stock. I don't care about your vouchers. I care that a woman named—" Brenda felt comfortable treating a human being like trash because she thought nobody was watching. "I care that a man like Preston Wells thought his bank account gave him the right to abuse your crew." She stepped closer, poking the lawyer in the chest with a finger. "You want to save your stock price? Here is some free consulting. Fire the entire management team at JFK. Retrain your staff on basic human decency. And pray that I don't decide to call in the loans on your London and Tokyo fleets too." Marcus went pale. "You wouldn't." "Try me," Morgan whispered. She sidestepped them. "Come on, everyone. We have a flight to catch." The executives were left standing there, impotent and humiliated, as 200 people marched past them. At Gate B-14, the Helios Global corporate jet was waiting. It was a modified Boeing 787 Dreamliner, painted in matte black with a gold sun on the tail. It didn't look like an airplane. It looked like a spaceship. As the passengers boarded, they gasped. There were no rows of cramped seats. The interior was designed like a luxury hotel lounge. There were sofas, dining tables, a stand-up bar, and private sleeping pods. Morgan stood at the door, greeting every single person. Not as a CEO, but as a host. When Captain Miller and his crew walked up, still carrying their gear, Morgan stopped them. "Captain," she said, "I meant what I said about the job offer. But you can't fly in those uniforms. Regal Atlantic doesn't deserve to be represented by you." She signaled to an assistant who had appeared from the jet. The assistant was holding a stack of black Helios flight jackets. "Welcome to the team," Morgan said, handing Miller a jacket. The captain stripped off his Regal Atlantic blazer, dropped it into a nearby trash can, and donned the black jacket. He looked 10 years younger. "Let's go home," Miller said. As the doors closed and the matte black jet pushed back, leaving the Regal Atlantic plane dark and abandoned at the neighboring gate, the terminal erupted in applause. But while the passengers were sipping vintage wine and eating catered meals at 40,000 feet, the real war was just starting on the ground. 3 months had passed since the JFK incident. The world had moved on to new viral videos, but for the people involved in that day, time had stopped. The scene was a sterile, oak-paneled deposition room in a high-rise in downtown Manhattan. The air conditioning was humming, but Preston Wells was sweating. Preston had not gone quietly. After being released from police custody that night, he had launched a scorched earth legal campaign. He sued Morgan St. James, Helios Global, the Port Authority, and even Captain Miller for unlawful imprisonment, defamation of character, and emotional distress. He was seeking $50 million in damages. He sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 junior partners from his firm. He looked thinner, his eyes dark with lack of sleep. The viral video of him being dragged off the plane screaming, "I know my rights," had been turned into a meme used by millions. He had become the face of entitlement. Opposite him sat Morgan St. James. She was alone. No team of lawyers, no paralegals, just her, a bottle of water, and a single manila folder. "Mr. Wells," Morgan began, her voice calm, "you claim that my actions on November 14th caused you irreparable professional harm. Is that correct?" "You know damn well it is," Preston snapped. "I was a senior partner. I was up for managing partner. Now my name is a joke. I lost the Blue Horizon deal. My firm placed me on administrative leave. You ruined my life because you got your feelings hurt." "I ruined your life?" Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Interesting theory." She opened the folder. "Mr. Wells, are you aware that Helios Global acquired the firm of Harrison & Cole last week?" The room went deathly silent. Preston's junior partners looked at each other in panic. Preston froze. "That's a lie," Preston stammered. Harrison and Cole is a century-old institution. They wouldn't sell to a logistics company. They were facing bankruptcy after losing the Regal Atlantic account, Morgan said, sliding a document across the table. "I bought the debt. Then I converted it to equity. As of this morning, I am the majority owner of the law firm you work for." Preston picked up the document. His hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. It was a transfer of ownership deed. "So," Morgan continued, leaning back in her chair, "technically you are suing your own boss, which is a conflict of interest. But I'm not going to fire you, Preston." Preston looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You aren't?" "No," Morgan said. "Firing you would let you play the victim. You'd go on talk shows and cry about how the big bad billionaire crushed you. I have a better idea." She slid a second document across the table. "This is your new assignment. Since you care so much about standards and proper protocol, I'm transferring you to our compliance auditing division." Preston squinted at the paper. "Compliance? That's paperwork. That's for first-year associates." "Read the location, Preston," Morgan said cold. Preston read it. His face turned gray. "Office location, Anchorage, Alaska. Archive Facility B. You will spend the next 5 years auditing fuel receipts in a windowless basement in Alaska," Morgan said. "If you quit, you trigger the non-compete clause in your contract, which I now own, barring you from practicing law anywhere in the United States for a decade. If you stay, you work for me." She stood up. "So, enjoy the view, Preston. I hear the winters are long." Preston Wells, the man who wouldn't wait in line, slumped into his chair, defeated. He didn't say a word. He knew he was trapped, but the karma didn't end there. Morgan left the law firm and had her driver take her to a small, run-down strip mall near Queens. She walked into a payday loan and check cashing store. Behind the bulletproof glass, looking miserable, sat Brenda. Regal Atlantic had fired Brenda the morning after the incident. The union had refused to back her once the security footage of her mocking Morgan's clothes came out. She had been blacklisted from every airline, every hotel, and every customer service job in the city. Brenda looked up and saw Morgan standing in the lobby. Her eyes widened. She pressed the button on the intercom. "Here to gloat?" Brenda asked, her voice bitter. "No," Morgan said. "Here to close an account." "We don't have accounts for billionaires here," Brenda spat. "Not for me," Morgan said. "For my nanny, the one I was visiting before I came to the airport that day." Morgan slid a check through the slot. "My nanny passed away 3 days after the flight," Morgan said softly. "She lived in this neighborhood. She used this place to cash her pension checks because she didn't trust big banks. She always told me the lady here was rude to her, made her feel small because she was old and poor." Brenda stared at Morgan, realizing the connection. "I didn't know," Brenda whispered. "You never know," Morgan replied. "That's the point, Brenda. You never know who you are talking to. You never know what grief they are carrying. You saw a hoodie, and you saw a target. You didn't see the human." Morgan turned to leave. "Wait," Brenda called out. "I'm sorry." Morgan paused at the door. "I accept your apology, Brenda, but I can't give you your job back. Some lessons have to be lived." She walked out into the bright New York sunlight, leaving Brenda behind the glass, trapped in the cage of her own making. The wheels of the Helios Global 787 Dreamliner kissed the tarmac of San Francisco International Airport with a grace that Regal Atlantic had not achieved in years. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was not one of weary travelers desperate to escape a metal tube, but of a family reluctant to say goodbye to a shared dream. As the jet taxied to a private hangar, avoiding the main terminal entirely, Morgan St. James stood at the front of the cabin. She looked out at the fog rolling over the bay, the lights of the city flickering in the twilight. She felt a heaviness in her chest, the residual ache of grief for her nanny, but mixed with it was a new sensation: clarity. When the airstairs lowered, they weren't met by a story, lonely baggage claim carousel. They were met by a media frenzy. The story of the hobo billionaire and the hijacked flight had outpaced the jet stream. News vans from CNN, Fox, and local affiliates lined the perimeter fence. Morgan descended the stairs first, her hoodie zipped up against the bay breeze. She ignored the shouted questions about net worth and lawsuits. She simply turned and waited for her guests. She shook the hand of every single passenger as they deplaned. She ensured Mrs. Higgins and her grandchildren were escorted to a waiting black SUV, complete with car seats that her team had procured while the plane was in the air. "Thank you, Morgan," Mrs. Higgins had whispered, her eyes wet. "You made me feel like a queen." "You are a queen, Mrs. Higgins," Morgan had replied softly. "Never let anyone at a check-in counter tell you otherwise." In the weeks that followed, the shockwaves of the JFK incident dismantled the status quo of the aviation industry. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing crumbling of the old guard. Regal Atlantic Airways attempted to spin the narrative. They issued press releases about rogue employees and misunderstandings, but the internet is written in ink. The video of Brenda's sneering face and Preston's entitlement played on loop on late-night talk shows. The silent gesture, Morgan's hand cutting across her throat, became a cultural phenomenon. It appeared in music videos, in protests, and even in boardroom negotiations. It became the universal sign for "I am done being disrespected." 3 months later, Regal Atlantic filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The brand was toxic. Their stock had plummeted to pennies. That was when Morgan stepped in for the second time. She didn't buy the airline to liquidate it. She bought it to exercise it. She acquired the assets for a fraction of their value, stripped the name Regal Atlantic off every fuselage, and rebranded the fleet under a new subsidiary, Phoenix Air. The hiring process for Phoenix Air was unique. The first employee Morgan brought on board wasn't a CFO or a marketing director. It was Captain Miller. Miller, who had been ready to retire early with a meager pension, found himself sitting in a glass-walled office in downtown San Francisco, wearing a suit that actually fit. His title was Chief Operations Officer, but his mandate was simple. "I don't care about fuel efficiency right now, Captain," Morgan told him during their first strategy meeting. "I want you to build a training program. I want every gate agent, every flight attendant, and every pilot to understand one thing: we haul people, not cargo. If I ever hear of an employee judging a customer by their shoes, they're gone." Miller took the job to heart. He built the Humanity First curriculum, a program that eventually became the industry gold standard. He hired back the crew from Flight 492, promoting Sarah to head of in-flight services. They created an airline where dignity was the primary commodity. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in the perpetual twilight of an Alaskan winter, Preston Wells was learning a very different lesson about dignity. The Archive Facility B in Anchorage was exactly as bleak as Morgan had promised. It was a corrugated metal warehouse filled with boxes of fuel receipts dating back to the 1990s. The heating was spotty, the coffee was instant, and the internet connection was dial-up speed to prevent distractions. Preston sat there, day after day, auditing numbers. There were no junior partners to fetch him lunch. There were no clients to impress. There was just the cold, the paper cuts, and the crushing realization of his own irrelevance. He had tried to quit twice. Both times, Helios Legal reminded him of the non-compete clause that would strip him of his law license. So he stayed. He grew a beard. He stopped wearing Italian suits, trading them for flannel and heavy boots, ironically looking very much like the working-class people he used to mock. One afternoon, shivering in the warehouse, Preston found a receipt for a first-class ticket on Regal Atlantic from 1998. He stared at it for a long time. The price was astronomical. He thought about the seat he had lost, the life he had lost, and for the first time in his life he didn't feel anger. He just felt tired. He realized that his net worth had been his only personality trait, and now that it was gone, he was a ghost. Back in San Francisco, life had returned to a quiet rhythm for Morgan St. James. She sat in her study, the room illuminated by the glow of the fireplace. It was late December, a year after the incident. On her desk sat a framed photograph of an elderly woman with kind eyes and a weary smile, Nana Rose, the woman whose deathbed Morgan had left to catch that fateful flight. Morgan picked up the photo. "I did it, Rose," she whispered. "I made sure they can't hurt anyone else." It was a hollow victory in some ways. Buying an airline hadn't brought Rose back. The grief was still a sharp stone in her pocket. But she had turned that grief into a shield for others. Her assistant knocked on the doorframe. "Ms. St. James?" The mail came. Morgan sighed, expecting legal briefs or acquisition proposals. Instead, the assistant placed a single, red envelope on the desk. The handwriting was shaky, written in cursive script that belonged to a different era. Morgan opened it. It was a Christmas card. On the front was a photo of a family, Mrs. Higgins, her daughter, and the 3 grandchildren, who were now a year older and smiling broadly. They were wearing matching sweaters. Inside, the note was simple. "Dear Morgan, the kids still talk about the magic plane. You saved our Christmas last year, but you did more than that. You taught my grandson that it's okay to be strong and kind at the same time. He wants to be a pilot now. We hope you find peace this season. We love you. The Higgins family." Morgan ran her thumb over the ink. She looked at the expensive art on her walls, the awards on her shelves, and the billions in her portfolio. None of it held the same weight as this $5 card from a grandmother in Ohio. She pinned the card to the bulletin board, right next to the picture of Nana Rose. The passengers of Flight 492 had stayed in touch. They called themselves the 492 Club. They had a group chat that pinged daily with life updates, memes, and support. The hedge fund manager had actually helped Mrs. Higgins refinance her home. The college student who had been crying in row 3 was now interning at Helios. They were a disparate group of strangers bound together by a few hours of darkness and a sudden, blinding light of justice. Morgan sat back in her chair and looked out the window at the night sky. Somewhere up there, a Phoenix Air jet was crossing the continent. The pilot was likely one of Miller's trainees. The passengers were likely being treated with respect, regardless of whether they wore hoodies or suits. The karma had been served, yes. The revenge had been sweet. But as Morgan closed her eyes, she realized the true ending of the story wasn't the destruction of her enemies. It was the protection of the people they had tried to crush. She finally slept, dreamless and at peace, knowing that tomorrow the planes would fly on time and everyone from 1A to 34F would be treated like a human being. And that is the incredible conclusion to the story of the CEO who changed the aviation industry with a single gesture. It really goes to show that money is powerful, but using that money to demand dignity for everyone is the ultimate power move. I want to know what you think. Did Preston deserve his icy exile in Alaska, or was that too harsh? And would you fly on an airline run by Morgan and Captain Miller? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a huge thumbs up. It helps us create more long-form dramas like this. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you're the first to hear the next story of instant karma and dramatic justice. Thanks for spending your time with us. And remember, kindness is free, but disrespect can cost you everything. See you in the next one.